Just a quick message to everybody. We are recording the meeting this evening, for transcription purposes as well. It'll be posted on the Park District's website. Good evening. My name is Michael Lang. I'm the Deputy Director of Planning here at the Chicago Park District. Tomorrow, the Chicago Park District will release the Lakefront Shoreline Conditions Assessment. This is a comprehensive study that was launched by the Planning Department in response to record high lake levels and intense storms that happened in 2019 and 2020. And this heavily impacted our shoreline. This assessment evaluates the physical conditions and structural types of our Park District infrastructure, creating a framework for more resilient planning, maintenance, and community education. In a minute, our team will provide a high-level overview of this assessment, which again, ultimately will be posted on the Park District's website. Throughout the presentation this evening, we would encourage you to use the Q&A, and our team will be prepared to answer questions throughout the meeting. In addition, we will leave some time at the end of the meeting to further address and clarify some of those questions that came up in the Q&A. We thank you all for joining us this evening, and now I'll turn it over to Noel to start our presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. I'm Noel Weber. I'm a Lakefront Planning Coordinator with the Chicago Park District. And as Michael stated, today I'll be giving this presentation on the Chicago Lakefront Shoreline Conditions Assessment. So to get started, just wanted to provide a quick introduction on the Park Districts. And if you're hearing a beeping in the background, I don't know if you can hear that. That's just people joining the Teams meeting. So please ignore that. But to get started, I think it's important to note just how much of the lakefront the Park District owns, manages, and maintains. That is over 26 miles of Michigan shoreline in Chicago. There are a number of other property owners along the lakefront, including both public entities and private individuals. The Park District inherited the land from previous districts and park commissions after their consolidation in 1934. And in order to maintain this vast amount of infrastructure, in order to plan for improvements for it, and in order to essentially carry out those improvements, we work with multiple other agencies, including the Chicago Department of Transportation, CDOT, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, among others. As Michael is stating, this report will be posted on chicagoparkdistrict.com/lakefront by tomorrow, that is June 16th. And again, this webinar recording will also be available on that website. I'd like to start out with our land acknowledgement. So I'll just read through this for everyone's information to start. The Chicago Park District acknowledges that we are on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes like the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox also called this area home. Located at the intersection of several great waterways, the land naturally became a site of travel and healing for many tribes. Today, Chicago is home to over 100,000 urban Native American community members that still practice their heritage, traditions, and care for the land and waterways. A land acknowledgement is an Indigenous protocol performed on Indigenous lands across the globe. The Chicago Park District seeks to restore trust and repair harm with Indigenous and Native communities who experience genocide, displacement, and dispossession due to settler colonialism on these lands. We name the stolen and exploited labor of Africans and their Black descendants who have cultivated these lands for generations and who continue to face structural violence and oppression legitimized by this enslavement. We acknowledge the labor of Black and Brown people, immigrants, and refugees who have been displaced. We will work in partnership with these communities through education, community engagement, relationship building, and taking action to materially support community healing rooted in inclusivity, equity, and respect. As stewards of public land, we recognize our responsibility to manage and preserve these spaces in ways that honor Indigenous knowledge and values. We are committed to working in partnership with Native American communities, the original caretakers of this land, to protect ecosystems, respect sacred spaces, and ensure the land, waterways, and lakefront's vitality and historic roots are sustained for generations to come. To reread this statement, you can access it at the location below. That's chicagoparkdistrict.com/land acknowledgement statement. All right, getting started on the what we'll be covering today. So we'll start out with the origins of the project, where this project came from. That is what Michael had mentioned earlier, and those high lake levels and storm activity. We'll talk about the goals that we set out in pursuing this study. We'll give some historical context of the lakefront, and then we'll get into the meat of the report, which is the data gathering and analysis that was conducted, the primary metrics that came out of the report, which are the condition, vulnerability, and assessment scores. I'll describe more on those later. And then we'll talk about both the lakefront section specific and lakefront wide strategies and recommendations that emerge from this report. Finally, we'll finish up with our next steps and have time for questions. So NOAA has tracked lake levels since 1918. We have data going back to then. On the bottom right, you can see a graph provided by NOAA going back to that time period. And for our use today, I've zoomed in on the last 12 years of it since 2014. So to explain more about this graph, each dot is a monthly lake level for Lake Michigan. And each section of the blue line indicates the annual average lake elevation during that time, water elevation. The green line, or sorry, the orange line indicates the historic average, so hovering just under 579 feet. Again, this is in feet, and that is basically from sea level. So the lake is not 580 feet taller than us right now. So the lake levels have been shown to fluctuate over time, over the periods of 5 to 10 years, reaching historic highs and historic lows periodically. In 2020 and 2019 and 2020, the lake level reached historic highs after just years before being at a historic low. This, coupled with intense storms that shook Chicago that year, resulted in widespread damage throughout the lakefront. The Chicago Park District, working with CDOT, with the Army Corps of Engineers, and with other local partners, worked on measures to temporarily stabilize the shoreline in the face of these high lake levels and storms. You can see that through armor stone that was added back in 2020 along different sections of the shoreline, and also in what are called trap bags. Those are those large black bags that you see in sections of the lakefront that are filled with sand or rock. However, we understood that there was a need for a longer-term study, planning, and improvements to protect the shoreline and other assets in the face of what we are coming to understand are more extreme cycles of high and low lake levels that are also happening with greater frequency. So taking a look at some of these storms and some of the damage that occurred at that time, you can see on the left here, we have Burnham Park. This is near 49th Street, near a place that is often called the Morgan Shoal area. You can see just how high the lake levels were at that time. There's a pretty intense storm with some high winds coming through. And so the water's overtopping our protective infrastructure there, pooling onto the lakefront trail there. And in places, it was pooling into Lakeshore Drive as well. And then again, this happened all throughout the lakefront and affected all of Chicago, really, where up near Lincoln, just north of Ohio Street Beach, there were, you can see the water pooling onto the lakefront trail there as well. This is a clearer day, but this, I think, shows just how high those lake levels were, even without a storm blowing, clearly impacting the recreational capacity of the space during that time. But it did not just impact the recreational capacity of the space. Once these waters recede, or once they've continued battering the shoreline over time, it can result in widespread erosion. So here you can see that happened at South Shore Cultural Center. After overtopping the protective infrastructure there, flowing behind it, and ultimately the water flowing back into the lake, it eroded our shoreline protection infrastructure, even so much as carrying a lot of those concrete blocks out of position. On the right, you can see the temporary protective measures that were implemented during that time or after it. In 2020, we have armor stone that's being laid down and then the concrete blocks being replaced and additional trap bags being placed as well. Here's the area from 49th to 51st Street, just part of the area. Here you can see again, the water had overtopped and then pooled and eroded underneath the lakefront trail. After pooling there and staying, it froze, and when water freezes, it expands slightly, so that cracked the lakefront trail from underneath it. And all that section of the lakefront trail had to be replaced, and you can see that happening in the image to the right. And then all the way up at Howard Beach, you can see this was another area that was significantly impacted. So on the left, you can see a photo from earlier in 2020 where, again, the revetment there had been overtopped, water had flown around it and carried and eroded underneath those concrete blocks, and ultimately resulted in many of their collapse. And so a lot of the sand on that beach was also washed away by these intense storms and high lake levels. And so in order to protect the shoreline, in order to protect the park behind the shoreline as well, temporary armor stone was placed in that area, and that does still remain. So from all of this damage, the park district knew, again, that we needed to do a kind of lakefront-wide study. And so this study provides a first of its kind comprehensive look at the physical state, which is the condition, the physical condition, otherwise known as how much deterioration is in a section of lakefront infrastructure, and the vulnerability. The vulnerability is how likely something is to be overtopped by high lake levels or storm action. And this is for Chicago's entire lakefront. This plan is going to serve as a guiding document. This study is going to serve as a guiding document to evaluate the physical condition of this vulnerability, and then take further planning actions and really inform how the park district stewards the lakefront going forward. We're going to be incorporating this information into framework plans, construction plans, resilience improvements, in seeking grant funding, really into across our lakefront operations here. And then finally, the other goal of this was to identify strategies and actions to continue protecting and enhancing the shoreline. These strategies included both lakefront-wide and section-specific. And the lakefront-wide strategies include actions across categories that are capital investments, non-capital investments, and operational resilience. I'll get into those a little bit later in the presentation. Getting into the historical context of the lakefront, it's really important to note that the majority of the Chicago lakefront is man-made. This land it was originally submerged prior to this. Much of it was for industrial use back in the early 1900s. Public access to the lakefront had largely been reduced. And so through the actions of visionary planners like Daniel Burnham, the city of Chicago took action to create parks on the lakefront. So here you can see that those actions occurring. You can see essentially we have outlines of the landscape to come using armor stone and blocks. And then behind that, lake fill, essentially sediment at the bottom of the lake, was pumped onto the behind those blocks to fill in behind them and create the land that is there today. Much of this occurred in the late 1920s. So here we have shown Daniel Burnham Park. There's also images that show it for Lincoln Park as well. So here you can see from the south end of this is what's known as Promontory Point. This is a little bit further into the process where you can see more of that lake fill has been included. Some grass is starting to grow into there. Some vegetation is starting to grow behind it. but largely still informal. And then by the early 30s, we see that landscaping has been placed. We have more formal lakefront protection. You can see that revetment that starts to form there. We have structures that have started to be built. So this occurred within a strikingly quick period of time, and was a major engineering achievement. But with it being man-made, it also comes with challenges. Um, Unlike natural environments, which are made to be resistant to flooding and wave action and water receding, man-made environments are made to resist those forces. And in that resistance, they can take damage. So here is an area of Lincoln Park where we see some of those limestone revetments that were ubiquitous across Chicago, and the deterioration that occurred. So here we can see there was significant erosion underneath the limestone blocks that resulted in their shifting, and the wooden timber crib that was holding a lot of this had begun to fail. So the park district and local partners worked to shore up that with additional armor stone, with concrete blocks, and with grout and filling back in underneath that section of revetment. This is just one section of the lakefront. These actions for maintaining these areas were conducted across the entire lakefront multiple times. So this is, not a unique story. The park district has been conducting maintenance and these kinds of repairs for as long as the lakefront has been around in its form today. This brings us to one of the major projects, these repair projects and resilience projects that came out of other periods of high storms and high lake levels. So in the 1970s, we had high water levels in the storms that damaged sections of the lakefront. And in response to that, worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to conduct repairs and improvements in our northernmost section of parks and lakefront. However, in the 80s, additional high lake levels in the storms continued to batter the lakefront. And so the Army Corps of Engineers and the City of Chicago and the Park District realized that a larger study needed to be done. That was in 1993. And ultimately, that initiated the Chicago Shoreline Protection Project, which resulted in large-scale improvement projects being slated for large sections of the lakefront, which include much of Lincoln Park. You can see in this image to the right, Burnham Park, Solidarity Drive, and then down by Rainbow Beach, the water treatment plant down there. Much of this work has been completed to this date. Outstanding projects from the Shoreline Protection Project include Morgan Shoal and Promontory Point segments, which you can see circled as incomplete on the image down at the south of Burnham Park. Once these projects are complete, the Park District is responsible for maintaining the shoreline that has been improved and the shoreline infrastructure that's been created. So to evaluate and to analyze the entire lakefront as a whole, you would end up with not quite as discrete and targeted information as you could if you split it into specific parts. And so we did just that. We split the lakefront into 63 distinct segments. These segments are of varying areas and have varying shoreline features amongst them. And by features, I mean types of infrastructure, including some may just be a beach, some may have seawalls and piers, but they all have a varied amount of infrastructure across. So by doing this, it allowed for a more focused analysis and recommendations for each section of the lakefront, each segment. And it also allows the Park District to follow up on those and really use that information in actionable ways to seek funding opportunities, to evaluate which segments have most need, and to understand more of the context that those segments that the community and the surrounding park have with those segments. So getting into the data that was gathered for this report, As Michael alluded to earlier, a lot of the data that came from this was an analysis of the shoreline features across our lakefront. Although the Chicago lakefront itself is around 28 miles long, the shoreline, we have over 53 miles of shoreline features, as a lot of that is in harbors or in piers that jut out into the water. And so we have a tremendous amount of infrastructure that provides different value to the lakefront that requires maintenance. So in the report, we have a breakdown of this. We have a table that provides examples of each type of feature, and included in those are breakwaters, revetments, seawalls, groins, jetties, and then not displayed here, but in the wider report and in the wider table in the report, there's piers, beaches, bulkheads, and then a miscellaneous category. That miscellaneous category includes things like boat ramps. Um, so the feature type makeup here as well, revetments make up 40% of the lakefront at 21.5 miles of length. Seawalls are next longest, followed by the beaches. So we have a full breakdown of that. And then also within each overview sheet for the segments, we also have the lengths of features within each segment. Other data gathered for this report include imagery from across the lakefront. So on-foot imagery where our project team went out and took photos, you know, analyzed the sections of lakefront to analyze their condition. And we also flew drones over much of the lakefront to provide a more overhead view of the conditions across. Additionally, we have data from the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA. From the Army Corps of Engineers, we utilize data to determine the protection elevation across the lakefront. So how high are our protective features? How high are they built? Against FEMA data, which provides the high water levels that can be expected and high wave action that can be expected. And I'll get more into those later. So again, the primary metrics that came out of this report are considered our assessment ratings. Those include the physical condition. Again, any defects or damage across the lakefront. They include coastal vulnerability, which is the height of protection versus the extreme water levels that may occur. And then we have the overall shoreline assessment score, which is the average of those two. It's essentially our index to understand how much need a section of lakefront has. So for physical condition, again, we use those drone and on-foot images to rate each structure in every segment. The scores across structures or across features within a segment were averaged. So if one section of the segment or a certain length of it were a 1 and the other certain length of it were 5, we would take an average score for that to evaluate the overall condition of the segment. These scores are on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is in new or excellent condition, and 5 is considered virtually unserviceable or the most deteriorated. To provide some examples of these, you have over to the right, 51st to 54th Street is considered a rating of 1. This was the Chicago Shoreline Protection Project that happened in 2001, and is considered in excellent condition. The sheet pile wall shows no evidence of section loss. The concrete step revetment is consistent, and it doesn't show any significant defects. An example of a 3 is the Foster to Lawrence segment. This was constructed in the 1940s and 50s as part of the North DuSable Lakeshore Drive extension. So there is a uniform sheet pile wall. You can see it on the rightmost side of that shoreline. That's still intact. It still shows no sign of misalignment. So it's still providing that protection from waves further in. The upper limestone blocks are still regular and intact. but you can see that the promenade level has deteriorated relatively significantly. And then finally, as an example of a segment in the worst condition is Steelworkers Park. This is part of the this park is part of the former U.S. Steel plant. And essentially it consists of randomly sized dump materials, some of it left over from that plant, which include large slag stones. It doesn't have a coherent structure, and the individual component fragments can be unstable and may be subject to being easily dislodged if you have significant wave action or high water levels. So we have maps for each of these ratings. So again, these were the condition scores were averaged across each segment to get that overall score, where 1 is in better condition and 5 is in the worst condition. Here you can see on this map, anything in yellow is in better condition, but as it gets to a darker blue, it's in more poor condition. This is just showing the South Lakefront, just to provide a bit more of a zoomed in view. We do have these maps for the entirety of the lakefront. The highest ranking segments from these areas are physical condition are Steelworkers Park, 45th Street to 51st Street, otherwise known as Morgan Shoal, Fullerton to Armitage, 63rd Street to 67th Street, and then Park number 566. Now, for the vulnerability scores, again, this is considered how likely a piece of shoreline is to be overtopped by higher extreme lake levels. So again, to do this, we evaluated flooding data from FEMA and compared it to elevation data from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to determine what we define as freeboard in this report, which again we define as the distance between the max water level from those extreme water levels to be expected and the lowest point of the land and protective infrastructure. We say the lowest point, so here we're not doing the average vulnerability across an entire segment. We take the minimum elevation or the lowest point of that infrastructure and we use it to evaluate, to provide the vulnerability score for the entire segment. The reasoning for that is if a piece of shoreline infrastructure gets overtopped in one section, you can expect that water would flow behind other sections or really throughout the segment, really throughout the infrastructure, it would spread and can result in wider spread damage. So kind of as strong as your weakest link is the idea here. So for coastal vulnerability, just showing that same zoomed in image, but this is the map for the coastal vulnerability scores. Again, 1 is less vulnerable, 5 is more vulnerable, and from yellow to dark blue in terms of vulnerability as well. Given that is for the minimum elevation of any lakefront segment, you can see that from this score, we have a lot more segments that are rating from 3 to 5, indicating more vulnerability. So we can see that we have more segments that have lower elevations and may need more attention to increase their protective elevation. So the condition scores and the vulnerability scores were averaged to result in our overall assessment ratings. 1 is lower exposure for that again, so yellow, and then 5 is more exposure, that's that dark blue color. Here's that same section of lakefront, the South Lakefront, and the highest ranking segments for this were Park number 566, 102nd Street to the state line, Fullerton to Armitage, 63rd Street to 67th Street, and Hollywood to Balmoral. This is really going to be, the rating that we use as a quick look to say what segments need attention when we're looking at doing improvements along the lakefront. Also provided, I alluded to this earlier, also provided for each segment were contextual data for both the park itself and then for the surrounding community for each segment. So on each of the segment overview sheets. Those are in the appendix of the report. I'll talk more about those in a bit. We have 5 key factors noted. Those are recreational inventory, biodiversity, park revenue, need for equitable investment, and transportation. Need for equitable investment, we are using the Trust for Public Lands Natural Solutions tool to evaluate a 10-minute walk shed around each segment. And we use that to evaluate across 17 different equity indicators. Those include race, language, education, age, employment, community disinvestment, and others. Other factors were also gathered for the study. Those include those listed there, including critical infrastructure, water quality context. I'll save reading them all. These are available on page 41 of the report. So although we honed in on these 5 key factors for the individual segment sheets, we do have a table that provides a complete breakdown of all contextual scores and physical scores for each segment of the lakefront. So here you can see North Rainbow Beach. The beach house there is an example of something that would be considered in the recreational inventory or a field house. And then North Lakeshore Drive shown near Grant Park, example of that transportation inventory or that transportation context factor, where it's very close to that protective infrastructure. And so that protective infrastructure is providing it a benefit. Here are some examples of those maps that were created for some of these segments or some of these scores. So we have the recreational inventory there on the left. So again, that captures recreational assets, pools, playgrounds, courts, field houses, and also access to the lake via beaches and swimming areas. And then on the right, we have biodiversity. That captures information on natural areas and habitat, how extensive those areas are, how robust, and how contiguous they are, how unsegmented they are. So this study resulted in district-wide lakefront recommendations and strategies. These, again, are across capital investments. Those include pier and groin condition assessments and harbor resilience actions. Also, non-capital investments are included. That can be ongoing advocacy for state and federal investment, lakefront programming, and then resilience initiatives, which can include evaluation of navigational aids and working with OEMC on disaster recovery planning and emergency response. So they also resulted in needs and opportunities for the specific segments. So here is one of those segment sheets that I've been mentioning. So our appendix has the list of all 63 of these for each of the segments in the lakefront. And I just want to walk through some of the information that's here really quick. So we have the shoreline assessment section where it provides the overall assessment score that I was mentioning earlier and we just covered, as well as those general condition and vulnerability. And then, as I mentioned before, it has each shoreline typology slash feature that's included in that segment. Its total length, its average condition, and the max vulnerability or minimum elevation of that area. We also have those contextual factors that I was just discussing. So you see the recreational inventory there, biodiversity, park revenue, need for equitable investment, and transportation. And then we have the needs and opportunities. So this is really our narrative for evaluating all the information that we gathered from both the physical data that we received for this segment and also in interviews with stakeholders like park district staff, local state stakeholders, and local experts on actions that can be taken to improve the resilience of these, further planning efforts that may be beneficial, and potential sources of funding for seeking those actions. About that, we have the segment summary. This is a bit more information on the actual park features that are in there, a bit more of a narrative description about the state of the shoreline structures, And then additional information, like if there are other uh, property owners in the area or along the segment of shoreline, and if it's part of the Chicago Shoreline Protection Project. And then we have the site photography. So this shows images both from back in 2019 to 2020, and then also up to 2025 to provide the comparative view of the destruction of the conditions over time and provide a kind of modern day look at how that current state is. So getting to next steps, we'll be posting the full report and webinar recording tomorrow on June 16th. Again, there's the website for your information, chicagoparkdistrict.com/lakefront. I also provided that in the Q&A as a post initially here, so you can follow that link. We'll be incorporating the findings from this report into new and ongoing park district planning efforts, including a nature-based coastal resilience study that we are currently working on, funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And then we'll be coordinating with Park District departments on strategy and recommendation implementation. So making sure that our entire organization is aware of this and working to implement the recommendations here and strategies shown. And then we'll be utilizing the data and findings to help secure funding for future resilience improvements, some of these benefits have already begun to emerge. We are currently conducting a framework plan at Steelworkers Park, and we are conducting repair and improvement projects at Calumet Park, Montrose, and at Oakwood. All right. Thank you, everyone. Happy to take questions.
Hey, Noel. We've been actively trying to answer as many questions as we can in the Q&A. I think there's one here that's worthwhile sort of discussing, but could you sort of explain a little bit further on how the ratings work, particularly as it relates to the influences of things like um, some of the other variables that include nature and community in the
Yeah,
decision.
let me go back to that question, or sorry, that slide where I'm showing the full context of it. So we do have the environmental context, and if there's threatened and endangered species that take up refuge in those areas, and then the biodiversity. So um, we do consider those environmental aspects of the area around it. We also do have water quality that's tracked, and so this includes water quality data from that we use to determine um, bacterial levels in our lakefront areas for swimming purposes. Um, does that answer the question, or did I miss the mark?
I think that covers that. Would you be able to explain maybe what has already been done with adaptive nature-based solutions, like sort of the soft armoring versus sort of hard armoring?
Yeah. So our Department of Culture and Natural Resources works very hard on improving dune habitat across the lakefront. So there's some of those areas in near Rainbow Beach, in Montrose, um, and Calumet. So, and also in improving those. So those are currently going on, and a lot of those efforts are funded by the IDNR Coastal Management Program. So dune planting not only improves the local ecosystem, but by planting dunes, you're also shoring up a lot of that sand retention. And so even if those dunes are washed over or if there's wind that's blowing, you're more likely to retain that sand and that dune integrity by having it planted.
Thank you. Um, another um, another question here, and I know that we are looking at sort of the presentation tonight as kind of more the high level. we really do want people to sort of take a download and read the whole report because I know that you provided kind of high level snippets of the stuff this evening, right? But it's good that you're on this slide here in terms of the contextual data. When you say transportation, what do we mean by transportation? Does this include important access routes like the Lakefront Trail? Does this cover rail, highways, roadways? Like, what do we mean by transportation?
Yeah, transportation for the purposes of this study mainly involved the roadways that are nearby and any other kind of rail networks. Um, the Lakefront Trail itself runs all throughout the lakefront. That is Park District managed. But this study evaluated um, the proximity of that lakefront infrastructure to roadways and other transportation networks, not necessarily the Lakefront Trail.
Thank you. Okay. Um, Sorry, there's lots here. Um, how, if you could maybe explain how this plan might deal with multiple intrusions on Park District space by Shoreline owners?
Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
I guess um, maybe does this plan um, maybe does this plan address people who may have intruded or might be consuming space that is Park District space by other property owners? Maybe that might.
No, so okay, so here's what I can say for that. So um, this plan is mainly to evaluate the condition of the shoreline structure and identify potential actions for improving our resilience, right? We do have other information, again, getting to those contextual factors and some of the strategies identified for the benefits that this shoreline infrastructure provides both the wider communities around and then also the um, park space within. Now, one of the strategies provided is to clarify real estate ownership and responsibilities. So the lakefront is a complex network of real estate ownership that dates back to the 1800s. And so one of the strategies that is provided is to clarify and evaluate real estate ownership throughout the lakefront to make sure that responsible parties are stewarding their portions of lakefront.
Okay,
I hope that answers that question.
thank you. Um, I think this is a good question. I'm going to summarize this here, but we have this report broken down into 63 shoreline segments. Um, but was there thought about looking at these segments more regionally, AKA like a stretch that runs from Morgan Shoal all the way to Rainbow Beach versus maybe just the Morgan Shoal segment? And
Yeah,
I
let
guess
me
maybe
pull this up.
why 63 segments and not 5 or 20,
63 segments were chosen really based upon making sure that it's actionable. Part of it was, how much can we fit in based on local wards, other local boundaries, contiguous sections of parkland, and then based on typology. So we really felt that fitting it into these more discrete segments would make it more actionable because it was also based upon, you know, what sections were contiguous. So, for example, you see that here in Ward 46 near Montrose, we have a segment for, I'm going to take my mouse here. You can see 13 here and then 14. So we have separate segments to kind of show both the harbor And then, the outer protection. So those are two different typologies that we felt should be evaluated separately. Now, as far as evaluating the overall integrity of, say, a park or like, say, all of Burnham Park, that doesn't mean that, since we've segmented it into these various areas, that that analysis is not being done. Right. We still have this information to make wider spread decisions about an entire park. So, for example, if we get a grant for Burnham Park specifically, we would take a look at all those segments and the integrity of all of them, and not just like break Burnham, not to say we're only going to address one specific segment of Burnham Park.
Thank you. Um, One question here is about the study that is happening from 71st to Rainbow, and, feels like there might be some overlap. Could you maybe explain sort of the park district's coordination efforts with, other parties who might also be doing lakefront planning work?
Yeah, so the segment from 71st to Rainbow is largely privately owned. And though the park district only really in that segment owns Arthur Ashe Beach, we do have the overall condition and vulnerability rating for that segment included in this study. So that information is, free for the community to reference or free for electeds to reference, whoever wants to take a look at their condition scores or vulnerability of their area. Now, as far as working with, and we are aware of those studies going on from 71st to Rainbow Beach, especially since it involves Park District property of Arthur Ashe. We do work with institutions that are doing with the Army Corps of Engineers and with PBC and CDOT to provide information on what we'd like to see at our property or how we'd like to be considered here. However, for the purpose of this study, we do reference different other ongoing planning efforts that are occurring. However, we mainly focus on the actions on Park District property, and that would be proposed. So, for example, for Arthur Ashe Beach, we may consider within there, how can we reestablish beach access? How can we reestablish a sand beach there? Is it feasible? How do we work with the community to do that? And so, those are also some of our conversations that we have in the midst of those other planning studies going on.
Thank you, Noel. And I'm sorry, I was reading some of the other questions, so I'm not sure if you answered this as well, but would you be able to also talk about coordination with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and sort of some of the other parallel paths in terms of updating the GRR and some of those other efforts?
Yeah, I don't know why I muted myself. So yes, um, as far as working with the Army Corps of Engineers on the GRR and other efforts, the GRR is also considered within our overall lakefront planning efforts. It is included in overall maintenance that we conduct on a regular basis. This plan does reference those activities. It references the ongoing and regular maintenance that we have for throughout the lakefront, and it does not supersede any of those actions. So, for example, the Chicago Shoreline Protection Project, this plan does not supersede or provide discrete recommendations for, say, how to build coastal infrastructure. It largely states that additional planning should be done, that it provides information on funding streams that can be identified to fulfill those actions. But as far as yeah, it largely works in tandem and references those other ongoing studies. And likewise, we would use this plan to inform our conversations with the Army Corps of Engineers and with other entities who are conducting planning efforts, say as they're doing the GRR.
Thank you. Um, I know some of our team members are here actively trying to answer some of these other questions. You know, we are going to sort of stick to more of the high level ones. Um, and site specific ones, we're sort of happy to continue to have conversations regarding those. Um, can maybe Noel, you explain why, we take this back to the 2019-2020 conditions?
Yeah, I can mention that. So this study really began in 2019 and 2020, and that was the last really major series of events that occurred on the lakefront as far as damaging events, just due to how high the lake levels were and how intense the storms were. Since then, the lake levels have largely receded and are currently low. And so we feel that the conditions of the lakefront as provided back to that point and are reflective of their wider state at this point. Um, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. Yep. Um, I think we've covered most of the high level questions here, at least that I've seen. Matthew, do you see any other questions that you think that?
No, not on that more high level lens, but
Yeah, I will note that this study is, or well, this webinar is to address questions on the overall study and the overall information within it. Upon publishing on our website, again, the specific information for each segment will be available in the report and in the appendix. And so you're welcome to reach out to us if you have any more specific questions about information in a segment of Shoreline that you're close to or that you care about.
And Noel, maybe if you could bring the slide back to where people can find that on our website?
There you go. So it's chicagoparkdistrict.com/lakefront.
Great. Thank you.
All right. It seems like um, we are okay to close. All
Yes.
right. All right. Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this webinar. Again, we'll be posting this report tomorrow on our website, and we'll also have the webinar and slides for your reference as well. Um, Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about the report, about the information within it. We are happy to address those. Thank you.